Hey there. Happy Wednesday and welcome to today's webinar, How to Tackle Key Grading Reform Challenges as a School Leader. My name is Kendall and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. I'm the Product Marketing Manager at Otis. I'm also a former middle school special education teacher and reading specialist, so very happy to be here with you today. This webinar is sponsored by Otis. Otis is a K-12 assessment, data, and insight solution that really provides the tools and data educators, students, and families need to monitor and improve performance. As you think about today's topic, grading reform, we know, and we'll talk more about this, that is often coupled with strategies such as formative assessment or reporting on progress towards priority learning standards. Otis helps schools do all of that in one place. I've got some housekeeping items for you all, and then I'll hand it off to today's speaker, Don Smith, Director of Professional Services from First Educational Resources. First Ed is an amazing partner to us at Otis, and Don brings over 2 decades of experience with assessment and grading to our conversation today. Don will tell you more about this, but he's also written a book. I'm a believer in it. I've read it myself, and that really served as inspiration for today's content. The book is called Extinguishing the Fires Within Assessment and Grading Reform. There's a lot of really good stuff in there that we'll touch on today as we discuss what it looks like to really shift your grading practices. But for a few technical reminders before I hand it off to Don, just to make sure you have the best possible experience. Please check the audio settings on your computer as well as your speaker volume if you're having any trouble. If you're having issues, there is a detailed audio troubleshooting file in the resource list under the Q&A window. You will see we've also compiled some resources for you all from Otis and First Ed, just some nice takeaway handouts that supplement what we're talking about today, so you have tools to take back to the team. If at any point your console freezes or you hear music after we've begun, just give your page a quick refresh. We'll still be here after you refresh, but that'll fix everything up for you. There's also some other icons that open additional features in the panel. You'll see that there's a resource list. That's where those resources I mentioned can be found, but you can also download the slides. Don has a lot of supplemental visuals that you may find helpful to your own work and conversations within your school communities. So definitely check that out. We'd love if you followed the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag EWWebinar. And don't forget to tag @Otis, OTUSK12, today's sponsor. As we jump into the discussion, we welcome your questions. And thank you to all who submitted questions ahead of time. We have reviewed those and we're going to incorporate them throughout, but please type questions in the Q&A box, not the group chat. That'll just ensure that Don and I can keep track of everything that's coming in. And if we're not able to address your question live, we'd be happy to follow up with you afterwards and give you some guidance. My most favorite question, is this going to be recorded? It most certainly is. You'll be able to access an on-demand archive of today's presentation within the next 24 hours. There'll also be a free to download version of slides and everything using the same login that you used today. So don't worry if you have to step away or you're only with us for just a bit of the time. All of this can be accessed later if you want to revisit the content. So that covers all of my reminders and little housekeeping items. I'm excited to hand it off to Don Smith, who is really here with us today to address 2 common assessment and grading challenges, and either how you can proactively avoid the issue altogether, or if you're already experiencing this challenge, how you can navigate through it. As I mentioned, we'll pop in some of your questions throughout the presentation that you submitted, so feel free to tee us up with those. But without further ado, hey Don, how's it going?
Great, how are you?
Doing well. We're ready to talk all things assessment and grading.
Excellent. Well, I'm excited to be here with everybody here this afternoon. So thank you for that introduction. That was great.
Absolutely.
As we begin to jump in, you can see we're going to cover 2 assessment and grading misconceptions, or as we kind of call them, fires that pop up within assessment and grading. The first one being, can't I just take someone else's priority standards and learning targets? The second then, which is a kind of a different topic, is then my kids don't care about the test. So then we'll have a couple of Q&As in the middle, a chance for folks to answer some questions. And as Kendall said, we did take a look at the questions that were submitted, and we have some couple of answers to kind of dig into around those. So as we continue on, a little bit more about me, I'm a former director of teaching and learning in 2 districts here in Wisconsin. So I'm coming to you from Wisconsin today. It's a beautiful 55-degree fall day outside. So I'm super excited to to dig in and talk more with you. Leaves are falling. I'm not sure what the weather's like by all of you, but it's definitely a beautiful fall day here. So prior to being Director of Teaching and Learning, I was also a district assessment coordinator, building principal at a school that was 3 through 5 and is 6 through 8. And also then I was assistant principal and I taught science at the high school level. A little bit about my journey, about how I got into assessment and grading. I was in my second year of being an assistant principal. And in my district, we got to go to a national conference at least once a year. So then when I took up my opportunity, there was a conference near Chicago on assessment and grading. And I'll be honest, I was going because of the peers of who I was going with. I was a little interested in the topic, but mainly because it was the folks that I knew that were going to the conference. And so I went to the conference. And as the conference went on, even to this day, I don't even remember who I actually went to the conference with. But I certainly remember what I learned. And I came back from that conference and I was talking to my superintendent, and at the end of the conversation, he said, "You seem really passionate about assessment and grading." And I said, "Well, thanks. I am. There was a fantastic couple of days of learning." And then he said to me, "We think we'd like you to lead our district through this journey." And I chuckled at him. And keep in mind that the district I was an assistant principal in, I was assistant principal of one middle school. And we have, there were 3 middle schools in the district, about 10 elementary schools, and 1 high school of about 2,000 kids. And so I said, "I'm just one assistant principal." And I said, and I went to a single conference, "I'm not ready to lead this." And he chuckled and he said, "Well, other duties as assigned." And then off and running, it was my job to help lead our district through it. I would say after about the first year, I got an incredible partner to help me lead our district through it. So together, we learned a lot in those couple of years about things that went well. We think of the title of our book, Extinguishing the Fires Within Assessment and Grading Reform. Some things went really well and some things did not. But then I'll tell you that I was able to take that from the things I learned about what we did well, what we didn't do well, then apply them into those other districts where I've been able to be Director of Teaching and Learning. And now I get the opportunity to support schools really around the country on various topics. So you can see I'm the co-author then on Extinguishing the Fires with Matt Townsley, Garth Larson, and Becky Pepler. I'm also then the co-author on Leveraging the Block Schedule for student learning and student growth. I also support schools around student schedules. So as we continue on, why we wrote this book and why this is so important to us is typically there are times when we're brought in from the very beginning and we support schools from the very start of their standards-based grading journey or grading reform, how they're thinking about grading differently. There's other times that we get a phone call where an example recently was a large district in southwest United States where they've been doing standards-based grading for a certain number of years, and things weren't going well. A couple of board members were elected, and it became a hot political topic. It had exploded into what we considered to be a fire, and they were elected on the sole purpose to potentially get rid of this. They were elected, and then it was gone. And so we got a call to say, how do we put this out? And for us, we're like, well, the fire's kind of already burnt, but we kind of had some fun discussions kind of around that. But as you see, if you get a chance to dig into this book, it's actually 16 different scenarios, 16 different fires that we dive into of scenarios. These are all real world scenarios of things that when we're working with schools, every chapter starts with a story about one of us, whether we are running a PD session or we're in a staff meeting or we're with a parent. Each of these are 16 different fires that we work through that will probably sound very familiar to a lot of folks. But in this webinar, we're going to take a look at 2 of those as we jump in. The first one being, like I said, can I just take someone else's priority standards and learning targets? The second one then being, my kids don't care about the test. So as we just briefly talk, it's important to know, we at First Educational Resources, this center is called our STAGR Center. STAGR, S-T-A-G-R, stands for Standards, Targets, Assessment, Grading, Reporting. So we support schools in all components of that journey, wherever you are with your standards, targets, assessments, grading, reporting. The only state we haven't had a chance to have boots on the ground yet is Alaska, but we have supported districts all around the United States. And the one thing that I say that we truly bring is that we bring perspective. And I can tell you from coast to coast, today we have folks working in California, all the way over to North Carolina and New York. And it's about, there's no perfect way to do this. It's about, does it work for your teachers, Does it work for your students? Does it work for your administration? Does it work for your parents? Does it work for your community? And so we can tell you this is what it looks like in other places. And so you'll see that we don't have a set script. We follow this roadmap where we work with schools and districts. And this roadmap then is our general process we work through, but we typically work with schools and say, where are you currently in this process? And we help support you with what works for you and your district. So as we kind of work through folks, and today's first initial topic kind of starts with the prioritizing standards part of it. So when we're working with schools through this, the first step in the process is to take a roadmap, and many of you have already done this. So if you've done this, let's just kind of revisit that moment when we begin by helping folks say, how do we achieve clarity through our selection of priority standards? That's our goal. Like, how do we get clarity around what are the standards? What do we really want our students to learn when we're first beginning this journey? So as we continue on, we say we use the Real B template, which is adapted from Ainsworth and Reeves. Our template looks like this. You'll be able to see it in the slide deck. We work people through you can see it's the same real process you've seen from others, just what our template looks like. But you can see we look at the standards and we say, does this standard help them prepare them readiness for the next level? Does it have endurance over one point in time? And I always give the example of when I was teaching high school science, I was during the time of when Pluto, was it a planet or no longer a planet? And I was passionate about that. And we spent way too much time on that. And I just always ask then folks and say, when is the last time that you knowing whether Pluto is or is not a planet impacted your daily lives? And people have usually begin to laugh at me, which times begin to laugh at myself and say, was that something I should have spent that much time on? Did it help prepare kids for the next level? Did it last more than just that one day of just knowing it? Was it on an assessment, their state assessment coming up, something big that they're measuring their students on? Leverage, does it help them apply to other content areas? Or V, does it connect to what you're doing for your vision of a learner, however it is that you do that? But that's the general process we work through. But as we're doing that, and I can tell you, just 2 weeks ago, I'm with a team of teachers. And when we first do this, we typically hope and we think that the journey is going to be this smooth road. And everyone's going to sit down and everyone's going to be happy. And we're going to say, let's just all dig into standards. And we all assume we all love talking about standards. But typically what ends up happening then as we're digging in is that it's not this smooth path. In reality, it's this bumpy, curvy, twisty, turny road that we're going on. And very quickly we realize it's a lot of work, okay? And teachers usually, from my perspective, have begun, they're usually pretty excited at the beginning. And they say, we're excited to dig into this, but it doesn't take long for folks to say, how many content areas do I have to do this for? Or how many classes do I have to do this for? And isn't there someone else who potentially has already done this work? Because I'm already feeling exhausted and I'm only halfway through my first course. And I don't know, like, why is it I have to do this? And hasn't someone else already done this? That's where the question of, can't we just take someone else's priority standards? Like, they'll say, and they're great questions. They say, can't we just, someone's already done this. Like, can't we just work smarter, not harder? I have 5 preps, and I'm teaching elementary. I have to teach all the subjects. I have to do this for every single class. And typically at that point, it's important. It's a moment where we realize we haven't done a great job to say, why is it we have to do that first step? We kind of go back to the very beginning of like, why are we prioritizing standards? And so we use this quote from Michael Jr. that says, when you know your why, your what has more impact. So our what at that moment is prioritizing standards, but why are we doing it? And so what we typically do then is we kind of go back to our why. Why is it we slow down with folks and we say, here's why you can't just take someone else's standards and use them. So for fun, we are going to begin with a quick example of taking a look at some standards from Wisconsin. So on the screen here, you see 3 middle school, 6th grade, 7th grade, and 8th grade English language arts standards from Wisconsin. So when you're taking a look at these, and this is a great point, so if you're ever looking for helping folks understand why is it that we have to slow down and all take a look at our standards, this is a great example to start. So if you were to say you're a teacher from 6th grade, 7th grade, or 8th grade, if you had picked this as your priority standard, the question I ask folks is, what is the difference between the 6th grade standard, the 7th grade standard, and the 8th grade standard. And as you're looking at this and staff examine it, this is a good one because it's only a couple sentences it's about one sentence for each one. Folks think about, well, what is the difference? And as you work through it, you quickly see the only difference from 6th grade through 7th grade to 8th grade is the language changes from evidence to support. They use then the word strongly supports. So already, hopefully, we're building a narrative around, well, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to me? And if I'm a teacher in 6th grade, how I interpret to support an analysis versus if I'm a teacher in 8th grade, where it's then that strongly supports, what does that mean to you to strongly support? And quickly, I think teachers start to see standards are very open to interpretation. Even though they were written by folks who did incredible work, who have selected these standards for us, there still is a lot of interpretation. So what would instruction, what would assessment look like from 6th grade to 8th grade? What would be the differences? How about just what's the difference between 6th grade and 7th grade? Those are the exact same words. So if you had 2 teachers in 2 separate rooms and they each picked that as their priority standard, what would be different? How would they know what would be different? What's the difference between each level? So as we're working through this example, it's a great example for folks to say, well, if we just gave these to you and said, go run with these, what does that mean to you? Why are you picking it? What's the deep meaning behind it? So I was working then with a district out in, actually a group of curriculum directors out in New York. And they said, well, that's Wisconsin. Your standards are messed up. You guys like cheese and you like things like that. So they kind of give me a hard time a little bit. But so I said, okay, let's pick a standard from New York. And here's a lot of words on the screen. Okay, so this is then from 6th grade to 8th grade. And to make it a little bit simpler, so you don't have to read the entire thing, you'll see the only difference from 6th grade to 8th grade is that they went from the difference of, in 6th grade, it was some, to in 8th grade, it was many. So once again, you see all of those words for those 2 standards on the screen. And the only difference for that standard in the state of New York was in 6th grade, it was they had to do some of them and then show mastery of many of the conventions of the academic language. So it was a quick moment for those folks in New York to say, okay, we can see that maybe we do want to think about these first and have some discussion around it. So as we continue on then, a couple of other examples just for fun. You can see another one from 6th grade to 8th grade. They have the wording of with a focus on increasing to an 8th grade was to increase. And I think hopefully you're getting the hint of there's just a lot of things that are just open to interpretation there. And what does that mean from one teacher to another can be very different. Another example for you, and these are all just quick examples that you can throw on. So you can see with all this wording, the only difference is with clear reasons to logical reason to logical reasoning. So teachers quickly begin to see, okay, so we kind of get it. We probably have to really be able to dig in and say, this is what the standards mean to each of us. But like we said, over time, folks begin to really dig in and say, why do we still have to do this? Haven't you already sorted all this out? And just, at the end of the story here, this is the Wisconsin standard at the top, the 6, 7, and 8. And then I went and I found the exact same standard in New York, and come to find out we have the same standards, right? So in Wisconsin, it says strongly supports, whereas in New York, it said to strongly support. That was the only difference in how we worded it. But in reality, it's the exact same. So if we were to give these to us, it's important to remember we need to take our time and really slow down. And so we say to folks then, once again, why is it we have to do this? And let's just also take another half a step back of a major kind of fire we hear is we say, we're doing this because our goal is standards-based grading. If you say that to your folks, if you say that to your students, your parents, your teachers, our goal is standards-based grading, that's why we're prioritizing standards, then we quickly say that should never be our goal. Because if that's our goal, then what are we really working towards? We say our goal is clarity and consistency. So when we work with schools, you're going to hear us say, like, your goal, one of the easiest ways to potentially put out a fire, your goal shouldn't be standards-based grading. Your entire goal of everything you're doing around grading reform should be all about clarity, consistency. So if you go back to any of those standards that we put on the screen, you'll see that we need to slow down and think about what do each of them mean? What does it mean to teach this in 6th grade versus 7th grade to 8th grade? What does it mean to assess it? And then how do we have consistency from classroom to classroom about the understanding what that means and consistency around high levels of instruction. So we always tell folks, slow down, and really that's our goal. That's why we're going through this, is that we really want to have clarity and consistency. So if we stop and take a look at the visible learning research, you'll see that teacher clarity has an effect size of 0.85. Those of you who've done a lot of work with clarity, you know that an effect size, or say a lot of work with visible learning, 0.85 is very high. That's about twice as high of the standard years worth of teaching. So when we're thinking about why we have to slow down, we have to really help our teachers understand we have to build your deep understanding of the standards. So we just like to always talk about clarity and how we can have a lot of misdirection. Those standards I put on the screen, hopefully you thought about, there's a lot of spots where how you would interpret the standard versus how I would interpret the standard could be very different. You might see it as a squiggly sign. You might see it as a signs going in two different directions, but it's really important for us to slow down and say, what do those signs or what do those standards truly actually mean? And so these are some fun signs for you when you're using, like, these are actual road signs out there. Do not enter, enter only. I was telling Kendall before we got started, this is a picture I took from the Charlotte airport, where if you zoom in, kind of lean in, you'll see it has exit to the left, and just below exit, it says no exit beyond this point. And we just put these up there because a lot of our standards are written like that. And so when we talk about clarity with folks, with schools, we really say we are taking a look at 5 components of clarity that we're trying to get. Clarity, like we said, in the standards we teach, clarity in what success looks like for our students in our teaching practices, and some folks use proficiency scales with that, or they use rubrics. Then we say clarity in how we assess learning, then clarity in how we evaluate it, and clarity in how we communicate it. So clarity isn't just putting a learning target on a board. Clarity is a detailed process here that we work schools through to say, what does that really look like? So when we go from classroom to classroom, we'll have a very clear idea of that. So we say to folks, the process of prioritizing standards, it's 50% about the final product of what you're going to get. In terms of a lot of districts we work with, end up putting all that all on the website. They have a beautiful page where teachers, students, parents can go and see, here's what our prioritized standards are, here's what we're assessed on. But we say, but in the end, it's you having a deep understanding of what your standards mean. So we say to them, the process is just as important. So the process of going through the standards and you as a teacher understanding your standards is just as important as the final product of having them prioritized. So it's not just about us giving you a pre-printed book of here are your prioritized standards to look from. It's about you having that deep understanding of them. So then we say, why is it you have to do it? This is a huge moment as to why you have to do it. But on the other hand, we also work with districts that are large. We work with a large district just outside of Charlotte with 30 elementary schools, for example. If they were to try to get all of their elementary teachers into a building to work through prioritizing standards and having a deep understanding of their standards, it would take a long time. Thinking about 30 different elementary schools, I just imagine having 30 different sets of second grade teachers coming together and trying to facilitate that. That could be a really difficult process for them and could take a while. So we say in some districts, due to size and time constraints, some of the work is done for the teachers. So whenever that happens, though, inevitably, today we have a consultant in a district working with them, and all of the teachers were given proficiency scales, products that were done. And the majority of the teachers were not involved. So the questions we typically get then is, who decided this? And what does this standard, what does this proficiency scale mean? What does this word mean? And where did it come from? And so it's sometimes it's funny. On one end, we get the beginning of like, can't we just take someone else's? But we also see the example of this, where it's given to them, and we see this, and then it's about they wonder who decided this, where did it come from? So it's almost like we see angst and frustration on both ends of the spectrum. One is they have to do the work. The second was it was given to them. So, but what's important is, as we said, slowing down and them having a true understanding. So if you're in a district where you have to do this for teachers, then we say we help them slow down and work through the why and the how. And where did this come from? It's really important for them to have that understanding of these are great questions. Who did decide it? Well, what does the standard mean, and where does it come from? So then in those situations, we say to them, slow down. Sorry, I went just too fast there. And where our advice is to have them go through the process, pick one of the standards at least, or pick a group of them, have them prioritize, have each group of teachers work through a small version of the process that the district worked through, so they have an understanding of, as we just go back to that slide, who decided it, what does it mean, and where does it come from? Because if you just give teachers the final product, a lot of times we see that frustration kick in there. Kendall?
Yeah, thank you so much for digging into all of that. I love the process is just important as the product. It's so true. And I imagine for school leaders who are kind of sitting here thinking about this in their own practice, at least for me, the why is so important, right? Instead of saying like, no, we're just going to go through this process, but explaining exactly everything that you did, the value behind it, and that why just makes conceptualizing the future work so much greater, and the value of that and really being bought in. I mean, we know about, I'm sure you talked a little bit about effect size, but collective teacher efficacy, if we're all bought in, we're going to see much greater results. So I thought that was just a really good connection to that. Couple questions we've got that I'm hoping I can toss at you here before we keep going. And thank you so much for the questions that are coming in from our attendees here today. This is so great to see such good engagement. But one of our school leaders who's here with us today is wondering if you have any suggestions on how to create authentic and viable feedback that is more helpful than traditional grading systems currently are. So thinking about that feedback piece, how can we cultivate authentic feedback?
Yeah, so I'm going to jump back to our slide here, which has our table of contents. And I laugh because chapter number 2, as I'm grabbing my book in front of me open, if you haven't gotten a copy of the book, we do recommend you get a chance to grab it. Chapter 2 is just about, hey, my current assessments work just fine, okay? And it really digs into how do we provide feedback to folks in our current assessments, and then how do we use that information? How do we redo our assessments and dig into actionable items? And so recently, like I said, I was with a district working with them on their success criteria. And one of the things we say to folks is, we're taking a look at a traditional grade, and we say, what does an A, B, or C, D mean? And I always one of our co-authors, Becky Pepler, always tells a story of when she was a teacher at the high school level. It was parent-teacher conferences, and a parent said to her, so picture this, it's a dark, stormy night in Wisconsin at about 8 p.m. at night, and a parent says to her, well, what does my student need to do to improve on this test, right? And she thought about it. Well, she had given the test back to the kids 2 weeks ago. All she could see in the grade book was like an 86. And she thought to herself, well, what does that mean? And so we say to folks, clarity and consistency. Part of that clarity is clarity on what the students did or did not do well. And so how do your current assessments give you that information that you can use to then provide that feedback? And in reality, as Becky said, when she's being completely honest, she had to say to the parent, well, I need to, she knew what was on the general assessment, but what did that 85 or 86 actually mean in terms of areas for next steps for growth? So she had to then be honest and say, well, I gave it back. So then she had to hope the students still had the assessment. Then she can go back through that specific assessment, look at those specific questions, and then provide support. And so if we're being honest with ourselves about our current assessments and what they look like, how do they provide feedback? And our grade books that we have now, our grade books should be a mini data warehouse of where our kids are relative to the standards. But a lot of times our grade books are just numbers connected to assignments. And it doesn't say where our students need to improve. So as you probably can guess, we can spend a lot of time on that one. And there's some fantastic activities, but that's a quick answer for you now, for you now on that one.
I'll just put in a mention for Otis rubric assessments as I hear you talking about that growth journey, and that, we should be able to say, well, you did really well with this skill, and maybe you struggled with this one, which often isn't represented in that 85%, but Otis has some really great rubric assessments where you can give feedback on specific descriptors and really say, hey, you are meeting this goal, but this is the one we need to focus on, and kind of move past that. I'm at a 70% or I'm at a 72%. What does that even mean? I need to work on, citing text evidence. Something very specific and tangible is just so powerful. One more question for you here, Don, before we jump back into the content. This is a good one. We get this one a lot. One of our attendees today is looking for examples or guidance on how to work through translating proficiency scales to a 100-point scale. And then kind of a secondary, if there's any ideas on how to bring students and families into that conversation. So kind of moving past that traditional 75% and translating those proficiency scales. Any guidance on that?
Yeah, because the one thing you're going to hear from, as you heard me say one time already, is that if it doesn't work for your teachers, eventually it doesn't work for your students, doesn't work for your parents and community, it's not going to work, right? So we feel strongly about getting to know what is the pulse of your community. And that's where we say there isn't one set version of this that works for every single community. And the district we were in, I'll never forget the first one I was in. By the third year, our middle school teachers all voted to get rid of letter grades entirely. But if I, as the assessment coordinator, got rid of letter grades, I would have been run out of the community and not had a job. And so I had a dilemma. The teachers say, let's get rid of these letter grades. But I knew that if I did that, I would be out of a job. So how do we reconcile that? And so there are definitely multiple examples of districts we've worked with scales. And I know we'd be happy to potentially share those with you. Or I know at the end, we'll kind of talk about contact information, do a follow-up call of how folks do that. But part of it is taking a look at what is it you want the conversion to look like. There's definitely multiple examples definitely out there about that. But if it doesn't work, just, we're going to say to some places you still have to give letter grades. And so that's one of the biggest things we'll say, and I'll just jump to our roadmap. When you look at our roadmap, the thing that's most important is we're getting clarity on our standards, learning targets, and assessments. The first three steps of our roadmap have nothing to do with the symbol that we eventually put on the report card or the calculation. The first three steps in our roadmap are all about standards-based teaching and learning practices. They're not about how you finally report out. And so we have many districts that just work through these first three parts and still report out in a traditional way. So like I said, if you want, we can always do a follow-up call, just kind of talking about how those scales, but there's definitely many examples out there. And I wish I could throw one in the chat or a link, but I could find one later. But just know there's definitely many examples, but just know that we strongly believe on what's most important. Like, for example, that district where they had school board members that were elected to get rid of this, we said to them, you don't have to change any of the first three steps to prioritize standards, learning targets, observables, or assessments. You just have to change how you report that out. What's most important is your teachers have clarity and consistency from classroom to classroom. And just, if it's okay with you, Kendall, I saw just a couple of quick questions in the chat, just briefly. It's in the bottom corner of my screen.
Go
I can
for
see
it.
one asked about the timeline. In general, for us, the prioritized standards depends on how large your district is, but if you're a teacher with one prep, sometimes we can get the prioritized standards done in one PD day. Then as we work through what do those standards actually mean, so if you take that example of the 6th grade to the 8th grade and you dissect it, and we have different templates where we kind of dig into that, that can take another, sometimes up to a half a year. And then we take another year really looking at assessments. So you're looking at a solid 2 to 3 years of those first three steps to really dig in. And then we help folks understand it's never done. This is no longer where we've done this work and it's a binder on a shelf in our classroom. This is a never-ending process we advise folks to work on, because just because one time in July you selected a priority standard, whatever your process was to unpack it, understand it, whatever language your districts use, and then you wrote assessments, does not mean it works with kids. And so then when it does or does not, it's important to go back and edit it. So it's an always evolving, never-ending process. And I just see it in the bottom of my screen, another person asked, do you do this with does each school? No, it's usually then the district has a set of prioritized standards that they have everyone kind of dig into. So it's much more of a district level process that folks work through. So with that, I'm going to jump back in. Give me 1 second. Here we go. To now a different, related but different topic is my kids don't care about the test. And I can tell you, as I said, I work from coast to coast. And even just a couple weeks ago, I was sitting in the room. The teacher said, so after I prioritize all these standards, does it really matter? Because my kids don't care about the test. And there's another time I'm running a data retreat, and this district got a district report card. And it said, the reason why our school is not reporting well is because my kids don't care about the state assessment. And it was a kind of an eye-opening thing for me of everywhere I'm hearing this. My kids don't care about the test. My kids don't care about the test. Okay. So then it kind of put me down a rabbit hole of, well, let's talk about that. So as I'm going to take you on a journey. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I kind of create a narrative and kind of work through this kids don't care about the test concept. Okay. So for the beginning, let's assume kids don't care. Okay. And let's talk about how does that impact how they may eventually do on a test. So one of the effect sizes, if you go on the Visible Learning website, there's the idea of students' attitudes towards content domains. So if the kids say they potentially don't care or they're not good at something, because you've always heard the expression, I'm not good in blank subject area. Well, you see it has an effect size of 0.48. So that means it can impact, it's over and above that hinge point. So it can definitely impact the mindset. So if the kids don't care about the test, okay, it's going to have an impact on it, meaning that they potentially could do worse. They could not care. They could skip through the questions. They could go faster. It's going to have an impact. So already we know, okay, research shows if kids don't care, then it's definitely gonna hit them. So here's what kids are saying about the assessment. And I'm just gonna look at the bold words on here. Kids are saying they believe assessments at times, if we're talking about state assessments here, have no impact on their grades. They say that the tests are unrelated to what they are learning. They say that the teachers and parents don't really care about how they do on the test. Then they also say that tests serve political purposes, okay? So here's the part that's interesting to me when you take a look at this here and you look at these bold bullet points here that are the bold parts. This is actually the study that was done in 1991. So this is something kids have not, this isn't new. Kids have been saying this since 1991, that they don't think it's connected to their current classes. It has no impact on their grades, unrelated to what they're learning. They say that their teachers and parents do not care. And I'm gonna tell you, that's a really key part that we're gonna dig into, is that the students believe the adults around them don't care. And so as we're thinking about that, it definitely has an impact on that. So let's also talk about the tests for a second. And what's their influence? What does the current research say about standardized testing in general? Does that potentially have an impact? And the answer very quickly is yes, it does. 0.4 was that hinge point. The effects of testing is 0.63, okay? And so what does that exactly mean? It's probably a whole nother webinar to dig into of how does that positively or negatively impact schools? But yes, the tests do have an impact. So we heard kids saying that it's unrelated to learning. The adults potentially around them don't care. We know the tests have an impact. And now let's jump into this last group of what are the beliefs of the adults and what does the role of the adults kind of play into that? So let's talk about what do teachers think about high stakes testing? And my guess is if you could all fill in the blanks here with what teachers say. But here's a quote for you. Let's just look at the bold parts on the screen. Teachers said there are some benefits if you're trying to potentially use it to rank and sort. But for the most part, they felt the weaknesses of the testing outweighed the benefits, right? They say the tests are not a valid way to assess what students know. They say that more time then ends up being spent on tested subjects, while time in untested subjects is reduced or potentially even eliminated altogether. And so teachers as well don't say great things. So we began with the kids said the tests weren't really important, but we know that the tests have an impact. The teachers are saying they don't really like them. But really, as we jump into this next part, like I said, I'm continuing to create a narrative here. Stay with me, okay? Next is the teacher's beliefs around achievement and what are the teacher beliefs around achievement? How does that impact it? And if a teacher is really digging into it, here's the effect size from teacher estimates of achievement. You heard Kendall before really talk about collective teacher efficacy as number 1. On the current list, I looked yesterday, this is number 2, okay? This has an effect size of 1.29. So if a teacher believes a student potentially will not do well, the answer is they're probably then right in how they interact with that student, the things they say to that student, the things how they treat them. You can see that teacher estimates of achievement get deep into how we set expectations for kids, how we're going to use them for our teaching, our learning, the benchmarks we're going to set, the things we're going to give them. So teacher estimates of achievement have a massive impact on how the students potentially can do. So then when you say my kids will not do well in blank assessment, I just flat out say, you're probably right. You see the effect size, you have a major impact on how your kids are going to do that in that assessment. your beliefs about how your kids are going to do has a big impact. So here's another study that was done that was interesting around testing, is if you as a student, how familiar are you with the proctor who's giving you that assessment? Okay, this is a really interesting question of what does the research say about the familiarity? Because I can tell you that I know when the way we set up testing in a lot of places around the country, it's set up for what is the most convenient way to proctor that assessment at the time. Many elementary schools will do it by the classroom teacher, which is definitely fantastic. But especially as the higher up in the grade levels we get, we say, what's the most convenient way to set this up? But what the research showed was that when students were tested by familiar, as you can see, rather than unfamiliar proctors, the magnitude of how the students did their performance was both statistically and practically significant. Meaning, if the kids had a relationship with their proctor, and this study was from 1986, this is not a new one, okay? 1986, we've known this information, that if the students had a deep relationship with that proctor, it had a direct impact on how they would do potentially on that test. So that one to me it's really interesting. But as we dig deeper into that study, what the study also found was the more difficult the task or assessment, the more that mattered, how familiar they were. It said, I think about when I took the ACT, the picture is 16 to 17-year-old version of Don Smith. It was on a Saturday morning at a high school I did not attend, okay? And with adults I've never met before in my entire life. And so here I am taking probably at that point in my life, one of my most important tests and expecting to do well when it's in a place I've never been before, no familiarity. And one of those moments where we wonder, well, here's why we're so nervous. Like, what are we doing to support some of our students? Then as we dig slightly deeper further into the research, is that the studies found that the lower the socioeconomic status of the students, the greater the impact of that familiarity had positively on how students did. And the importance of relationships. Those of you who have done a ton of stuff about relationships, it's, as you can see, it's kicking in here. How familiar are our students with the proctor? It has an actual impact on how the students will do. So to me, already we're showing though, like, if we want the students to care, what are we doing to help them care about the assessment? It's kind of the question I begin to throw back out there for schools. So knowing all of that, okay, so if the adults don't care about the assessment, what impact does that have on our students? So picture a student gets put into a room on the day of your testing with an adult who believes this is not an important assessment. The adult does not see how this assessment potentially connects back to what they're teaching and they're learning. The adult doesn't see how this assessment is related to them in any way. And then we wonder, why is it that the kids potentially don't care about that? And so then we say, healthy data assessment culture starts with the leaders. And we say leaders, that's not just the principal of the building. It definitely starts there for sure. How does the principal say this test is either important or it's not important? But it starts with the classroom teacher as well, of like, how does that teacher cultivate the environment in their classroom? And I know it's about the whole child. I'm not saying this test is the only thing by any means, but it's how does this test then connect to what they're learning in the classroom? How is it important? If we can't answer that, then maybe we need to take a step back and figure out how it does connect in our building. And I love this quote here that says that the main impact of a leader's behaviors resides in the influence on the followers' beliefs and behaviors. And so we're thinking about from the teacher's impact on the students and the principal's impact on the teachers around why is the assessment important. It's all about how do our leaders guide that, and what is the culture we're trying to create around that. And so just really digging into those questions about what does that look like in your building, and if we want our students to care, we can't blame it on the students. We have to look at our own practices and think about what are we doing to kind of create that culture. So I love this. Valencia Clay had a post in 2016, and I have a couple of quotes from here. I'll just read them for a second. It says, as educators, it's crucial to remember that we're not just preparing our students to be good test takers. That's not what we're trying to do. We're preparing them to tackle real life tasks that they'll face once they leave our classrooms. And if we don't want them to give up on themselves when things get too tough in the future, we have to build their tenacity now. The foundation of such perseverance lies in intrinsic motivation. And so this idea of it's not always just also about the test, but if we're looking for, we truly believe there's no reason to give this test, at least we can say to kids, it's about perseverance. It's about, we're going to be in different tests at different parts of our life. I can tell you one of my own children had to take a driver's test today, a very real life thing. And their perseverance through that was absolutely vital, absolutely important. So it extends way beyond our classroom. We're always going to have these things. But this is a quote that was my favorite part that drew me to this article from Valencia Clay that said, low test scores are a reflection of being uninspired, not unknowledgeable. And so as we take a look at how students are doing on assessments all across the country, I'd like us to think about this. Are our students just uninspired when it comes time to take that test? Or are they truly unknowledgeable? There's a difference there. Do they not know the standards and the questions? Or do they have no reason to actually try to do well on the test? So if we're looking at my kids don't care about the test, I just slow down and talk through these three questions here and say, what do the adults in my building think about the assessment or assessments? And then what do the adults in my building say to the students about the assessments? And I'm going to also pause here because I've talked a lot about the state assessment level. But as we also think about classroom assessments, people will say, my kids don't care about our classroom assessments. And the thing they'll say is, until they know, they say they don't care until it's graded, or they don't care about a lesson, an assignment in the classroom until it's going to be on a test. And I think it's so important to pause and think about the language we use with our students. And I will say the example I will use is if you were to go in your district, survey your teachers in pre-kindergarten, whatever that looks like, in kindergarten, first, second, third, all the way up, and ask them, do kids come in, start the year asking you, will this be on the test or will this be graded? But in reality, there's a lot of situations where the language we use with kids, we use that test or that grade as a carrot or a stick, and we actually create that. I don't, personally, I've not met, that doesn't say they don't exist, but I've not met a kindergarten student who walks into school on the first day and says, is this going to be graded? Or is this going to be on the test? And I say, we create that culture as adults. And so this is one of those, I know it was also in the pre-question someone had submitted, like, how do we go about creating that? And I say the way we talk to kids is so important about, here's why we're taking this, because I need to get an assessment of where you currently are. We're using this as an opportunity for us to learn about our teaching and learning practices. And if we make it all about the end product, well, then we're going to wonder why sometimes the kids don't care until it is a test or they don't care about the state test. And so it's just an important thing, I think, to slow down and say, what are we saying about the assessment to our students? And if we as adults don't care, can't be shocked the kids don't. Lastly, then, what's the testing environment like? Who's doing the proctoring? Are we sending the kids off to ice cold rooms? Or are we giving them a chance to be with someone who they have a relationship with? My dream scenario in a district, it looks like this, that the day before the assessment, at least the weeks leading up, the adults are saying, here's why this assessment is important. Here's what it means to me. Here's what it means to your learning. Then the day of the assessment, they're with those same students. They're in the room. They're saying, we're so excited. Hopefully last night you did get a good night of sleep. Hopefully you're ready to go, because I know you guys are going to do your best today. They encourage them. They reference parts of the class of how they have relationships with them. They talk about, here's why it's important. They say to the kids, I believe in you. I know you're going to do exceptionally well, and I'm excited to see how you do on this test. And they kick them off. Versus it being someone that says, just reads the proctor directions and says, okay, starts a timer, sits down, and stands up when it's done. So with Kendall, I'll just kind of kick it back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for introducing those reflection questions. I think that's so powerful. And having been the proctor for many assessment as the special education teacher, I tended to always have students who I hadn't met before. I was always like, this doesn't feel right. They don't know me. They don't know my room. And it's so true. That environment is so important, and you should have that positivity. So I just appreciate you sharing that. We did get a lot of questions here. There's one that's a little bit for the both of us. So I think I'll start there and then kind of just go through with our last 10 minutes here. Some of the other questions, and just thank you again for all of the great engagement from our audience here today. We really appreciate you sharing these questions with us. But one of our attendees here today, Trish, asked a question around how much FIRST Education and Otis are involved in the process of assessment and grading reform. I can speak to Otis and then hand it off to you to talk a little bit more about the FIRST process, if that's okay. But from the Otis end of things, we believe grading reform can really feel less daunting when you have a system in place that supports the processes you're establishing. The process comes first, right? Thinking back to that clarity piece, it's powerful when you can answer the why. We talked a lot about that here today. But from a preparing your teacher standpoint, there's also the how, right? Teachers don't have a ton of extra time. And having a plan for how you're going to accomplish some of your grading and assessment shifts can be helpful. And Otis is really the tool that you can use to assess, track, and report student progress towards those learning standards. So just mentioning there that how we support is by simply aligning with whatever process you're doing and providing a tool that schools can use to track student progress towards standards. But Don, regarding FIRST, the question asks, is there a representative that attends professional development from FIRST at a school district? How do you support schools through that stagger model with FIRST Education?
Yeah, I'll just jump briefly, very quickly. We have various forms of professional development that we also run. So we have a couple of really upcoming great virtual webinars and in-person support. But the bulk of our work is in districts, working them through, whether a district just wants a keynote or to kick off the ideas and they want to run with it, or they want any part of this roadmap, we work with them on. So if they've already prioritized their standards, we can jump in with their learning targets and we talk about observables or success criteria, or they just want help with assessments. We go into districts and support them with each step of that. So as you heard me say, there are times when I'm in front of a large crowd talking to them about the why of this, all the way through, I'm with two teachers at a smart board or whatever board they use in the classroom now, and we're talking through, these are their actual assignments, and here's how that connects back to the learning target. So really, it's the whole process. Then we also support schools on the flip side of, we work with districts who've been doing this for X number of years, and we actually come in and do a standards-based grading analysis with them. We say, here's where you currently are, because so many places have had so much turnover over time that they struggle to say, here's what we said we're going to be doing, but now here's what we're actually doing. And so we work with a lot of folks on helping them get back to the roots of their why and go through that, because they have the massive turnover we've seen in education recently, where we said what we're actually 10 years ago is not all what we're doing now. So we help them close that gap.
Like, it's very much not a one size fits all, as in all things in education, very personalized to your needs, which is great. The next question we have here, I really like this one because I know I've discussed this during my time in the classroom, but what ideas do you have for countering the thought that if students receive multiple chances, they won't try the first time? How can we motivate students to always give their best effort, even though they may have multiple opportunities to demonstrate their mastery?
Yeah, and I can tell you that I'll never forget the teacher meeting when I was leading this the first time in my district, where the teachers came in and said, this is failing because the kids walk into my classroom, I give them the test, the student writes reassessment on the top, hands the test back to me, and the student takes a nap throughout my entire test. And they didn't even try on it. And so this is a very real issue we see across the board. And I'll tell you, chapter 13 of our book, if you get a chance to dig into it, is if I offer reassessment, my kids won't take the test seriously the first time. So it digs into that exact fire. That's a very real world fire that we come across. And we say it just starts initially with, once again, the language we're using. Do the students know why they're taking that? Have we built a culture that says, I need you to give me your best effort on this because I need to use this to drive my instruction next to help give you feedback. And if students think the purpose of the test is just to get a grade, well then, as with a big problem in education, we are chasing grades versus chasing learning. And how do we help our students understand that we need to chase learning? So it starts with the culture, but chapter 13 gets all into that idea of, hey, they're not going to try the first time. What's some ideas around how do we build that culture?
Can I just say, when I pulled that question out, I forgot that was a chapter in the book. So that could not have been more perfectly placed of a question. Yes. You all really do a great job of just understanding the landscape And similar to what we do with our students, right? We try to anticipate needs, anticipate questions. And that's just one thing I love about working with y'all is you do such a good job of anticipating the needs and getting ahead of it, which is, of course, I think what every leader probably wants to do here today is go into a staff meeting ready to address those questions that are inevitably going to come up, because how much better do we feel when we've thought about it or can point people in the right direction? So thank you for that. Thinking about the next question here, we did receive this one from one of our attendees, so thank you so much for sharing this. They're wondering about the philosophy of mastery before grades. How can we kind of reconcile that philosophy when many systems demand that we submit grades in a GPA? I know you touched on this before, but I just kind of want to circle back here and see if you had any additional thoughts on this one.
Yeah, I think that because most of us work in systems where we have to have grades in a GPA. It just is what it is, right? But it comes down to, and I've said to, because I get this question from teachers often, and I say it starts with you as a building coming together. It's never, an individual teacher can do it on an island in a classroom sometimes, but it's really difficult. It's much better when the whole building comes together and says, let's reinvent how we talk to kids about learning and how we talk to kids about grading. And here's a funny story for you. And in a way, we inadvertently did this, but the way one of the districts I worked with, the way our grade book was set up, and the conversion from 3, 2, and 1 to a letter grade, it was difficult. And what ended up being best is we actually shut the grade book off the first weeks of the school year, because the conversion, it just didn't come through the cleanest, and it made kids look like they were doing poorly than they would. We could dig into that. It's a whole other discussion as to why. But we shut the grade books off, and you would not believe what that actually did for our academic discourse over those first 6 to 8 weeks before we turned the grade book on. It's because kids were doing work to do the work, because they weren't seeing a letter grade. All they were seeing in the grade book was 3, 2s, and 1s. And they were thinking, well, why do I not have a 3? And what do I need to do on that standard in order to get a 3? It changed the entire discussion around. And so we always say, like, part of that is how can we eliminate the use of grades as much as possible? So the teachers all the way through the high school level. I think one of the questions was, can this be done at the high school somewhere? The answer is yes. Our high school teachers only gave 3, 2s, and 1s. It was our system that created letter grades. And I know Otis is a fantastic system that can do that as well. Of how do we keep it about the learning, where teachers are only talking about learning, and the grade book just does the calculation in the back end. And so that's one great way to do it, is teachers just talk about the learning where students currently are, the feedback they give them, and it's not about just that actual grade at the end.
Imagine that shifts the conversation among students. Yeah, we do. Sorry if I was lagging there. I was just saying that has to be so powerful for students to shift that when students follow their teacher's lead, right? So if we're talking about learning moments, I'm sure they are also going to think about that. We just have one more question and then we will wrap up here. And I think this is a good one to end with. But from your perspective, how can we prepare educators to adopt grading reform in a way that is transparent and really provides enough training and time for them to be effective? I know we've talked a lot about these concepts here today, but we haven't really necessarily established a timeline. And I'm just curious, what your thoughts are on how we prepare people for this process, because it's not an overnight change, right?
Yeah, so for us, it always goes back to the why and creating concrete, clear examples as to, let's talk about our current system and what's working and what isn't working. And one of the things we always say is, in the end, especially if you're, I know it's not on here, but a question of, like, when you're communicating with parents, always start with what's not changing. Parents are always much better off when you say, you're still going to get this, you're still going to do this, but here's the things that'll be different. But the same thing with working with teachers and preparing educators, to start with the why. We have a couple of fantastic activities we do with them, where we take a look at sometimes their own grade books, and we dig into what does this mean, or having them all calculate a grade based on the same assignment and seeing where we are differently, and just talking about what is that like through a student's lens. But first, build the why. We have to build this curiosity of, could it be differently? Because a lot of the frustration that we see from the adults is not that they don't think we should change. It's they don't understand, why are we changing? Then they don't understand the roadmap to get there. And that's where we just slow down with them and say, let's understand, here's why we're going to do a change, but then here's how we're going to support you through this entire journey. So you are not alone. You are going to then continue learning and growing together as adults, and we're going to go through this journey together. So because most of the frustration that we always say, if you ever look at the book Quality Implementation, written by Jenny Donahue, I think Stephen Katz, they say that most of the resistance you see from principals is principals feel like they can't support teachers when they have questions, And the most resistance you see from teachers is because they feel like they can't support students when they have questions. So how do we do both of those things, that build the capacity then of our principals and then build the capacity of our teachers? Because everyone wants to be able to support the people they work with, is what it comes down to. And so timeline, like we said, would be about to work through the entire process, potentially 2 to 3 years. If you're going to do it well, 2 to 3 years. Some places try to rush it. We recommend slowing down to that. So thank you, Kendall.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much to everyone for being here today. If you were monitoring that chat, I popped the link to First Education in there. We'll, of course, be following up with you afterwards. And Don very kindly included a chapter, a sample chapter of the book in the resource list today. So I highly recommend checking that out, just to kind of take a peek at one of the fires and how it's presented through that solutions framework that is in the book that we talked about here today. A great teen read if you are exploring grading and assessment reform. There's lots of good stuff in there. And to learn more about Otis and how we can support your growth journey with standards-based grading and how you really track student progress towards those target learning standards, we're at otis.com. We also included some free resources for you in the resources list today, an SPG checklist, a couple of downloads, so some really nice things there, hopefully to help you get started or just continue to build upon where you're at. But it was a pleasure to have Don here today. We love working with First Education and just really being those thought leaders in the space. So thank you so much, Don. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week.